How did our immigration system get so messed up? How did we get here? What were the steps that have occurred in the United States since the time of our founding that led to this broken immigration system that we have here in 2025? In this video, we're going to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of our nation's immigration history. You know, we were all taught in grade school that the Emma Lazarus poem from the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island, "Give us your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." We're going to see how at times that has been almost true, but for the most part, our immigration history does not track at all what you were taught in school, and I think you're going to find this video very, very compelling. In order to understand what happened and why we are here, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. So when the states were first formed and the Constitution was being discussed, the decision was made to give Congress the power over naturalization. Prior to that, each individual state had the ability to give citizenship, and they each had their own rules. So in order to cut down on confusion, the Founding Fathers decided to give Congress power over naturalization. Naturalization is the process whereby somebody becomes a U.S. citizen. James Madison warned that if you didn't have a national system of naturalization, that people or states would try to game the system, and that's why Congress was given the power in Article 1, Section 8 over naturalization and the citizenship process. A year later, in 1790, when Congress decided to exercise that power and institute rules of naturalization, they made it very clear of who was welcome in the United States and who was not. Our first Naturalization Act, the Naturalization Act of 1790, said only free white persons could become U.S. citizens. You had to be white, you had to live here for 2 years, and you had to show that you were a person of good moral character. What does that mean? No black immigrants, no Asian immigrants, no Native Americans having any kind of rights to citizenship in the United States. And would you believe that the free white person language stayed on the books until 1952? 8 years after Congress passed the first Naturalization Act, then came the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams. These laws let the president deport any immigrant he thought was dangerous. No trial, no hearing. One of those laws, the Alien Enemies Act, is still on the books today and being discussed by the Trump administration. What you need to understand is that right from the start, immigration wasn't just about who could come in, it was about who could not come in and who could be excluded from the United States and from our naturalization process. Let's fast forward to the mid-1800s. The Irish are fleeing famine. The Great Potato Famine in Ireland had led many people to starve to death. So Irish people came to the United States in droves. Meanwhile, tons and tons of German people were also coming to the United States, fleeing revolutions in their home areas. These immigrants settled in big cities like New York and Boston, and they also settled throughout the Midwest of the United States. But with those new arrivals came a new era of hate. The Irish were seen as poor and Catholic, therefore loyal to the Pope and not to the U.S. government, and they were unskilled. The Germans were more diverse. They were fleeing revolution, they had skills, they knew how to farm, and even though they were white, they were seen as outsiders as well because they didn't fit the typical British or Anglo-Saxon view of white America. Very interestingly, a new group popped up. They were called the Know-Nothings. It was a nativist political movement that literally tried to stop people from becoming citizens for 21 years. They really wanted to slow down legal immigration to the United States. They wanted to keep immigrants from holding office and to keep them from getting any kind of public jobs. So even as far back as the 1850s, we had groups that were organizing against immigrants and trying to pass laws to keep immigrants from being able to fully settle into American society. Sound familiar? Now, any discussion of our nation's long and tortured immigration past has to include the fact that there's a group of people who did not come here voluntarily, who did not say, yeah, let's go to America and start a new life there. Rather, these are our African American brothers and sisters who were stolen from their homelands in Africa brought to the United States to work for decades and centuries as slaves. And so whenever you talk about immigration and you think about, all the great things in our great immigrant history, this, of course, is a huge black stain on the history of the United States and something that we are still dealing with here in 2025 and beyond. And as painful and as ugly as that was, we have to remember that was immigration too. That was what we thought as a government and as a group of lawmakers that we could make legal. And that meant stealing people from their mothers, from their families, and taking them under horrible conditions in boats to the United States, and then forcing them to work for no pay for the rest of their lives. So in all these discussions of immigration, this is the darkest part of our history. In 1882, Congress passed the first major immigration law, which targeted a specific race of people in something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law flat out banned Chinese laborers from coming to the United States. No visas, no naturalization, no pathway to stay. This was the first time that America formally said, if you're from one of these countries, you are not welcome here. You cannot come to the United States. Period. This served as the groundwork for what became a purely racial immigration system. That is, a system based on race and country of origin. Moving along to January 1st, 1892. Do you know what that day was? That was the day that Ellis Island opened for the first time. For over 60 years, it became America's doorway to the United States for more than 12 million immigrants, mostly Europeans who were fleeing poverty, persecution, and war. These immigrants showed up with little more than a suitcase, a name, and a dream, but this was no red carpet. They were subject to medical exams, legal screenings, language tests. It was not easy. In 1907 and 1908, the United States government made a backdoor deal with Japan, the so-called Gentleman's Agreement. And the U.S. said, we're not going to formally ban Japanese people from immigrating here, but Japan, you should stop your people from leaving Japan to come to the United States. It wasn't a law, it wasn't on the books, but it was effective. And it was our first real taste of immigration control through international pressure, that is, through diplomatic means, keeping people from coming to the United States. This is something that we've seen for decades ever since, where the United States uses its political power and its economic might to force other countries to limit immigration to the United States from people leaving those countries. In 1917, Congress made it harder again for immigrants to come to the United States. They passed a law requiring anyone who wanted to naturalize to pass a literacy test. They had to be able to read 30 to 40 words in any language. It wasn't about education, though. This was a filter. This was a way to keep out poor, undereducated Southern and Eastern Europeans, i.e. not the white British people that had been coming here for so long. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, boom, 1921 and 1924, the Quota Acts. The Quota Acts were the first time that we set forth specific country conditions and rules on the number of people that could come from each country. And guess who they favored? Northern and Western Europeans, British, Germans, Scandinavian. If you were Italian, Polish, Russian, Jew, or God forbid Asian, you were out of luck. In 1924, we banned all immigration from Asia. No visas, no nothing, no citizenship, no way into the United States. So they weren't even being subtle about it. This is racial engineering at its finest, or worse. Back then, they couched the system as designed to protect America's racial character. So when you hear people say, my ancestors came here legally, you have to ask, yeah? Were they allowed because of who they were? Because the system was built for them? I think so. Because for millions of others, the doors were never open. And then we entered the Great Depression. In the 1930s, the economy was terrible, unemployment was high, and guess who got the blame? Immigrants. The U.S. government deported hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican descent, even U.S. citizens of Mexican descent. Did they get a trial? No. Did they get due process? No. What did they get? They got put on a train and sent back to Mexico without ever getting to see a judge or asserting their rights to stay in the United States. Does our treatment of immigrants improve during World War II? No, not really. We had Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, begging for entry to come into the United States. The United States even turned away the MS St. Louis. It had over 900 Jewish passengers denied entry into the United States. This was legal, but was it right? Just because the laws say that something has to go go a certain way doesn't mean that we are making the right decisions. This was done strictly because of our quota system, our requirement that we're not taking too many people, especially those Jewish people, or especially those brown people, and letting them into the United States. We didn't let them here because of anti-Semitism, because we didn't want them here, because we looked at Jewish people as different or other. Not to be undone, the United States then realizes in 1942 that we are low on men working in the United States because they're off in Europe or the Far East fighting World War II. And so they decide, well, we need labor. Let's let those Mexicans back into the United States. And so the United States launches the Bracero program, which brings in Mexican workers to fill labor jobs, farming jobs, agricultural jobs. Millions of Mexicans came here legally through the Bracero program, but they were discarded. They were forced to work for very low wages. They were overworked. And then when we didn't need them anymore, we sent them back to Mexico. Does this sound familiar? Again, it was legal, yes, but it was dressed up as opportunity. But cynically, we always had the plan to turn those people back and send them home to Mexico when we were done using them. In 1952, Congress passed its first comprehensive immigration law known as the McCarran-Walter Act, and this was a mixed bag. For the first time, it ended racial restrictions on immigration. That's the good news. It did, however, keep the national origin quotas. This was also the period of the Cold War, and we would see the United States government point out individuals and say, hey, they appear pretty soft on communism. We're not going to let them into the United States. So now political ideology was also affecting our immigration process and who got to come into the United States. So things were getting a little bit better, but you can still see the fundamental defects in the program even way back then in the 50s. Now in the mid-1960s, we reach a point where the civil rights movement is alive and well. The world, and America in particular, are looking for the rights of the individual, and we start to see some real positive change with our immigration history. In 1965, in the midst of the civil rights discussions in Congress, while African American individuals are fighting for their civil rights, this liberal way of interpreting our laws and looking to each individual as a separate human being with dignity of their own, Congress passed the Hart-Celler Act, which removed the whole quota system. It blew it up. No more giving 90% of our immigration slots to Western Europeans. No more deciding who gets to immigrate to the United States based on where their ancestors were born. Instead, Congress created a system based on two fundamental concepts. The first is family reunification. The second, employment-based visas. Now, for the first time in U.S. history, people from Africa and Asia and Latin America could come to the United States. The restrictions on their ability to get visas to the United States were gone, and they finally had a shot. Not that they were getting preferential treatment, they were just getting the same treatment as white Europeans when it came to applying for immigration benefits in the United States. Now, at the time, Congress believed that this change was not going to be very radical or have much of an impact on the breakdown of American society. But they were wrong. After these changes in the mid-1960s, the United States became a much more global country. The diversity we see here in the United States that we see today, you can trace it all back to that change in 1965. In fact, my own spouse was able to come to the United States because of those changes in the law. Her father, originally from Egypt, was able to come to the United States because he was a physician. The United States needed physicians, and because of these changes in the mid-1960s, he was eligible for a visa that he never would have gotten under the old quota system. So this wasn't just a policy shift, it was a moral course correction. It said the United States was not going to be limited by race and country of origin option. Now everyone has a fair shot to make it in the United States. More changes ahead. In 1980, the Refugee Act was passed. For the first time, we had a comprehensive system for allowing people to apply for asylum in the United States and for refugees to resettle here in the United States. Now this aligned with what we wanted around the world for international standards for the United States and what we wanted to promote, which was that people shouldn't have to fear or live in persecution because of their race or their religion or their political opinion, things like that. We wanted to make sure that the United States was a beacon of freedom, and that for people facing war or facing oppression, that they could come to the United States. This was a huge milestone in the United States immigration history, but it wasn't perfect. As you might imagine, we helped some groups more than others, based usually on Cold War politics. But still, it laid down a principle. We do not turn our backs on those being persecuted. At least that's what the law said. Now, for you to understand exactly how far we've come when it comes to the way that the United States talks about and treats immigrants, I want to play for you a clip of President Reagan speaking with President Bush when they were both running for the presidential nominee in 1980. They were both trying to become the Republican nominee for president, and they had this very interesting take on what we wanted in America for our immigrants and how we wanted to treat them.
Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence Why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit?
We're creating a whole society of really honorable, decent, family-loving people that are in violation of the law, and secondly, we're exacerbating relations with Mexico. If they're living here, I don't want to see a whole thing of 6- and 8-year-old kids being made, one totally uneducated and made to feel that they're living with outside the law.
And then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back, and they can cross and open the border both ways by understanding their problems.
I'd like to see something done about the illegal alien problem that would be so sensitive and so understanding about labor needs and human needs that that problem wouldn't come up.
The United States and our neighbors, particularly our neighbor to the south, should have a better understanding and a better relationship than we've ever had. And I think that we haven't been sensitive enough to our size and our power.
These are good people, strong people. Part of my family is a Mexican.
Can you believe that? They sound like flaming liberals today. These kinds of discussions are things that you might hear in the Democratic caucus. The Republican Party has moved so far away from the words of Ronald Reagan and the words of the first President Bush that it's actually sort of mind-boggling how the conversation has turned so restrictionist and so anti-immigrant in just 40 years. And during President Reagan's second term in office in 1986, Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. It did two big things. It gave a legal path for 3 million people who'd been living in the United States without a status since before 1982. It also cracked down on employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers. So we had amnesty and enforcement, carrot and stick. But here's the problem. The enforcement part ramped up. The legal path to immigration went slowly. But it was still a remarkable piece of legislation that was signed by a Republican president. It actually allowed undocumented people who were in the United States to get in line, to pay a fine, to fill out a form, and get on a path to legalization, a path to citizenship, the thing that President Bush and President Reagan were talking in that video. This all sounds good, and it was, right? But the thing is, it did nothing to fix the number of people who were here undocumented and lacking any kind of immigration status. They kicked that ball down the road. At that point, there was still no line to get into, no fine to pay, no forms to fill out that would allow them to become U.S. citizens or to be on a path to legalization. Moving on to 1996. Now, a lot of times when people think about immigration and they think about who are the hardliners and who are the liberals, they view the Republicans as those who are anti-immigrant and Democrats as those who are trying to save immigrants. But in 1996, Bill Clinton signed two laws that were the harshest, the meanest, and the most consequential for immigrants in the United States because they contain provisions that still last today, that still affect many immigrants in the United States and that have led to them falling out of status and frankly being unable to leave the United States. What's that? A Democrat? Bill Clinton doing things against immigrants? Say it ain't so. You have to remember, Bill Clinton wanted to paint himself as a centrist, as a neoliberal, conservative, whatever, who was trying to walk the line of passing comprehensive legislation and making sure that we changed our laws. Remember, he was attacking welfare moms and he was also attacking immigrants, and he got Congress to pass two laws that were very, very harsh when it came to immigration. The first is called IRA. It's the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. The second is the AEDPA. There's provisions in there. That's the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. Both acts contained parts of immigration that we still see today, specifically those provisions that make it very, very hard for people who've been in the United States out of status to then leave the United States because they receive long bars from being able to come back to the United States. So for the first time, if you were in the United States for more than 6 months but less than a year out of status and you departed the United States, you had a 3-year bar on coming back. If the overstay was over a year, you had a 10-year bar on coming back. And if you entered the United States without permission more than once and left the United States, then you had what's called a permanent bar under immigration law. These were new provisions and they had a very strong effect on people in the United States. What it did was it kept them from being able to leave because they didn't want to trigger the bar. Another big consequence of the laws that Bill Clinton signed was that green card holders lost a lot of the protection that they previously had. So lawful permanent residents, the people right below citizenship who've been here for a long time but had some kind of criminal action back in the day, who then depart the United States, when they come back, they could be treated as an arriving alien. They sort of lose that protection of being a lawful permanent resident, and it made it much easier for the government to deport them. Immigration judges from a lot of discretion. They used to be able to consider family ties, good things that the person had done, given reasons for them to not be deported, and the laws greatly diminished the ability of judges to consider waivers, and now waivers are only available under very, very narrow circumstances, which meant a lot more people were going to be deported. You can see how these provisions from 1996 lacked any kind of compassion, any kind of mercy. It was Bill Clinton trying to cozy up to a new kind of Democratic Party and to make it seem as if they could be tough on immigrants too. So in essence, the Clinton era, when it comes to immigration, really turned immigration into a trap. It's a trap! This is the system that we're basically stuck with today. There haven't been substantial changes to the INA or to the immigration rules since 1996. And so when you hear people say, oh, why don't these guys just get in line? Why don't they just fix their status? Why don't they just do something to get legal? Well, because of these laws and the laws that predated the 96 changes, it's actually not possible. Immigrants can't get in status. The vast majority of these people who are in the United States without status have no line to get into, no fine to pay, no form to fill out, no way to just get their papers. Next up, the DREAM Act in 2001. So this was a bipartisan bill that was designed to get status for people who were brought to the United States at a very young age without permission, who crossed the border with their parents, but who did nothing wrong. These are people who've been living in the United States for decades. They were just brought here through no fault of their own, and the Democrats and the Republicans had a bipartisan bill designed to allow these people to get into status, to have that line, to have that form, to be able to get into status. The thought was that at least we could agree for these people, these ones who had done nothing wrong, that we could get immigration reform at least for them. And the law was first proposed in 2001, and it took 9 years for it to work its way through Congress, for them to build enough of a coalition to try to bring this to fruition. By this time, President Barack Obama was in office in 2010, and even though the House was ready to pass it, and even though the Senate had 55 votes, because of the filibuster rule, they needed 5 more, and the bill died. Now, to be clear, they didn't kill the DREAM Act because they had some other solution or some other proposed legislation that would help these immigrants who did nothing wrong. No, this was just a matter of killing off legislation that would allow the Democrats to claim victory and say that we helped save these dreamers. You need to understand what a crushing vote that was, how disheartening it was for those in the immigrant rights movement, for these young people who did nothing wrong. They basically had no status, and they were subject to deportation at any time. These are kids who had grown up in this country, had pledged allegiance to the flag, had graduated from United States schools and universities, and basically Congress said, screw you, we've got nothing for you. And that failure, the failure of the DREAM Act to pass, is what led President Barack Obama to do what he could administratively, that which they could not do legislatively. And what do I mean by that? Well, they were going to change the regulations and change the rules to focus on deporting criminals and people who enter the United States without permission over and over and over. Basically, the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama made the decision that we only have a limited number of resources. We don't have enough money to deport everybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the criminals, and for those people who were here in the United States, we're going to use what's called prosecutorial discretion. We are going to decide to not deport these people so that we can focus on the people that are breaking the laws and committing crimes and violent offenders. That is where the DACA program came from, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. DACA allowed immigrants who came to the United States as children, who had no status in the United States and had no ability to get into status, to do 2 things. 1, stop their deportations, and 2, to get work authorization. Those are the changes that President Obama made, and you need to understand what a change that was, and it also impacted how immigration went up until today. And what do I mean by that? As I mentioned, the laws haven't changed since 1996. So when a president comes into office and is left with the responsibility of interpreting our laws and issuing regulations based on that president's interpretation of the laws, the big changes that we see in immigration don't come from Congress, but rather from who's in office. And that's why we've seen this pendulum swing from President Obama being pro-immigrant and trying to help them, to President Trump, who's trying to deport as many immigrants as possible, to President Biden, who took a lukewarm way of trying to help immigrants. He didn't really care that much about immigrants. And then we go back to President Trump and where we are today. But the great thing about DACA was it allowed these young people who came to the United States and had no status to come out of the shadows. It allowed them to get work authorization, to pay taxes, to contribute to society as teachers, as lawyers, as soldiers, as nurses. And it was a life-changing event for hundreds of thousands of immigrants. But DACA was under attack from the very first day. Republicans and conservatives and attorneys general in red states started suing the Obama administration as much as they could to try to stop the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. They wanted all immigrants who were in the United States without status to be deported the same, whether they were criminals or lawyers or nurses. So you can imagine what it would be like for these young people here. President Obama has said, come come on out of the shadows, give us your identifying information, we'll get you a work card, we'll stop your deportation. But lawsuits were being filed throughout Texas and elsewhere, and these lawsuits were designed to strike down DACA. So if that happened, these young people were going to be back in the position they were, and in fact, they'd be a little bit worse off because they had raised their hand and identified themselves as being here out of status. And we have to remember, the last thing about DACA is it was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be a fix until we could get those 5 more votes, until there were enough votes in Congress to allow these young people to get legal status. It wasn't a path to citizenship. It wasn't a long-term solution. Rather, DACA was just to slow down their deportations so that Congress could get it right and Congress could fix the problem for these young undocumented people. I think some criticism can be also laid on President Obama himself for focusing on the Affordable Care Act and putting immigration to the side. Democrats oftentimes put immigration reform as a low-level priority, and that has led to some of the inaction that we've seen from Congress. And now we reach 2016. Donald Trump has been elected president, and the first thing he does, besides planning a wall and vilifying immigrants throughout his campaign, is he drops the very first Muslim ban. Now, this was a ban that was thought up by Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller, 2 of Trump's loyal acolytes, and they stopped immigration to the United States for people from many, many Muslim countries. There was chaos in the streets. There was chaos at the airports. Customs and Border Patrol had been given no guidance on how to implement the Muslim ban. They were not allowing green card holders into the United States. They were not allowing citizens into the United States. Lawyers had to respond. They swung into action, and the Trump administration was sued left and right all over the country for the illegal Muslim ban. Lawyers successfully challenged the Muslim travel ban not once, not twice, but 3 times. It eventually went to the Supreme Court, and President Trump, as the executive, was given great powers by the conservative Supreme Court to implement things like the Muslim ban. And even though it was restricted in various ways, it was allowed to stay, and we saw President Trump not just banning Muslims, but also stopping refugee resettlement in the United States. So historically, the United States takes in 100,000 refugees from around the world, and President Trump stopped that directly, mostly because those people from countries that President Trump referred to as shithole countries, they were mostly brown and black people, and Donald Trump and his base didn't want those people coming to the United States. Candidate Trump had repeatedly vilified immigrants, calling the Mexicans who were coming here rapists, doing everything possible to make immigrants the other, the brown, the ugly, the people that we don't want here, and his base ate that up. And that led us in 2018 to the family separation policy. So here at the border, children were being separated from their parents. They were being put into cages. You'll recall the videos and the photos of human beings living in cages for having the temerity to enter the United States and apply for asylum. The rules say that you can apply for asylum at a port of entry, but the Trump administration was refusing to allow them entry into the United States, and if they did enter, they were separated. They wanted there to be fear at the border. They wanted to cut down on migration at the border, and one way they did that was to make sure that the word was getting out in Spanish and other languages that if you came to the United States with your kids, you were going to be separated from them, and you wouldn't know where they were, and you would all be detained in horrible, unhealthy, gross conditions. And when it comes to the family separation policy, we have to understand this was not a mistake. This was purposeful. This was part of the plan. Cruelty was part of the solution that the Republicans had come up with. They said, come here and we're going to make it hurt. And during that first Trump administration, we would see all kinds of changes to our immigration policies, both for legal immigration and illegal immigration. And one of those was the public charge rule, where they really tried to crack down on poor people coming to the United States by claiming that there were many, many immigrants who wanted to come to the United States but were likely to become public charges. And therefore, they tightened up the rules and made it much harder to sponsor a family member to come to the United States if they had low income. And then with the COVID breakout in 2020, the Trump administration invoked something called Title 42, which was a supposed public health measure, but allowed them to deny entry into the United States for asylum seekers without a hearing, without due process, without a credible fear interview, all things provided for under U.S. law. So throughout the first Trump administration, they were breaking the law. They were not following the law. They were doing what they wanted to do and saying, let the courts try and stop us. And as we've seen in all of our decades study of immigration, this was about keeping certain people out of the United States, a theme that has run throughout this video and throughout our nation's immigration history. In November of 2020, President Biden beat Donald Trump in the election, and once Biden came into office in 2021, we saw him roll back a lot of the very, very harsh Trump policies. He ended the Muslim ban, he reinstated DACA protections, he began rebuilding the refugee program and allowing refugees to come to the United States, and he ended the family separation policy. Was this an improvement? Undoubtedly. But President Biden Biden kept many of the other harsh immigration policies in place, specifically Title 42, and he kept denying asylum seekers from coming to the United States. Joe Biden never really cared about immigration. He never really cared about immigrants. It was a low-level priority for him. He brought back a lot of the people that had been in office towards the end of the Obama administration, and he had really did nothing to fix the wreckage that Donald Trump's Department of State and USCIS had done in slowing down immigration to the United States. And then in 2023, we saw a surge of people coming across the border, and it wasn't just people from Central America. We saw people from Haiti, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan, even India coming across the border and making claims for asylum. Well, the Biden administration wanted to try to handle that, and they came up with programs to parole these people into the United States so that it was a more orderly process and allowing them to enter the United States and to avoid being sent back right away. Again, it wasn't any permanent solution. It was just an administrative one. These parole programs, processing tools, and granting temporary protected status, TPS, for people from certain countries was a bit of an improvement, but it didn't do anything to really fix the problem. It was all just duct tape on a broken pipe. Then in January 2025, President Trump comes back into office and he runs on an anti-immigrant campaign. It's the centerpiece of his election, promises to deport 1 million immigrants every year. Again, Stephen Miller, his little sidekick, is pushing this policy to try to deport as many people as possible. And quickly, President Trump does lots of things to ramp up deportation. He empowers ICE agents. He turns USCIS, which is supposed to be the agency processing benefits, into an enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security. The travel ban comes back. This time there's 12 countries that are completely banned from sending people to the United States, and there's a limited ban for people from 7 more countries. So again, we see the president stopping immigration. The administration stops taking any refugees, so there'll be no more refugees that are allowed to come to the United States. The Trump administration also declares war on all those people who are paroled into the United States under President Biden, says that they're not going to give them immigration benefits. The Trump administration quickly revokes temporary protected status for people from all over the world, from war-torn countries, even people who've been in the United States on TPS for decades. So there you have it. You can see for yourself how over time our immigration policies have shifted depending on whether we needed immigrants or wanted immigrants. When economic policies drive us into the ground and we start looking for a scapegoat, the easiest scapegoat of all is immigrants. You've seen how Democrats don't really care that much about immigrants, and they don't really push it as a primary legislative issue. You see how Republicans have shifted from those discussions that we showed you between President Bush and President Reagan, and how they were having a meaningful discussion about the benefits that immigrants bring, and now where we are now, where the only thing out of the GOP when it comes to immigration is how terrible immigrants are and how we have to deport as many as possible. So our history is back. We are deporting people again. We are seeing skyrocketing numbers of people being grabbed and thrown into detention and set up for being sent back home. It's really a dark day in our immigration history, but it's one we've seen before. So you shouldn't be surprised, and we hope you found this video helpful, that you learned something about how the past is prologue and we are back where we were many, many times before in an era of anti-immigrant enforcement and vilification and detention and deportation. Thank you.